Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Welcome everybody to this event. It doesn't be an event quite like it. We blame or thank Pamela, who we'll turn to at the end. She asked me to start off by welcoming the different sorts of groups that she's been encouraging. I know emails have been flying from Pamela in all directions. First of all, she wants to thank two anonymous donors for funding the event, and in particular, I think, for affairs for Mike Schiffer. Parkside Community College loaned their video equipment. Stan Waitsford, who was a gap year student, was trained from Hillgrove video station. Now, amongst the others in here, Cambridge University Archaeological Field Club, Cambridge Archaeology Unit, Cambridge Archaeology Field Group, several fellows at the South of Antwerp, a little bit of their here as members of the University of Sheffield, there. Members of the Cambridge Aquarium Society, researchers from Oxford, Kent, Sheffield, Exeter, Southampton University, I think. I'm totally a little bit like yarn. Everybody welcome. So thanks enormously for coming. What we'd like to do is, Alan suggested that I should begin very briefly, I suppose, what my take was with just what is new archaeology, because many of us have lived it. Then we're going to get Colin Renfrew to say a little about his experiences, and then Ezra Zubrow, I should say, Ezra who's from Buffalo, to talk, and then Mike Schiffer, who's Tucson, Arizona, who's going to give his take, and then me, say that my experiences of coming here, finding myself in Cambridge's version of new archaeology. Started night, we got changed from classics to archaeology halfway through a degree. And then the idea is really just to throw it open, but we've got various people who were involved in all of this from different perspectives. We've got Paul Mellars in the department, Rob Foley, who's now in bioarchaeology and Elshers, Robin Dennell. Robin and I were undergraduates together. Robin's now at Sheffield. Marek Zvelebil, who is at Sheffield, where I remember driving down as a keen young lecturer to introduce him to Professor Graeme to persuade him to do a PhD. Graeme had forgotten that he arrived with nobody there, and Marek almost marched off in disgust as background why he had studied. So we've invited people with these different perspectives to be here to again contribute. But also, if it is possible to do it, we obviously would like to end up with a kind of conversation and questions and answers across. So we'll start off with these statements and reflections really, the four of us. So, a new archaeology, I suppose that the way we generally characterise it, there was this, I mean, it has its origins in the 50s, I suppose, as Ezra was saying to some of the students the other day. But in the early 60s and through the 60s, I suppose archaeologists were trying to say that much of this cultural prehistory in a way was a pseudo-history. It was full of migrations and diffusions of different sorts of peoples, characterised by their pots or their flints or whatever. And I suppose that the key things, people are arguing for that archaeology should be trying to get a process, which is why it became termed as processual archaeology, what they call culture process. That it should be trying to do it through new ways of thinking, through the scientific process, the whole business of the hypothesis testing and so on. So there are arguments about trying to get into new ways of thinking, of trying to go about things as in the scientific method. And then, of course, also to bring in the scientific methods as well that were burgeoning. I've always thought one of the best examples to understand the incredible transformations that period for those of us who were living through it as students, in terms of what it felt like that archaeology could do in terms of methods, is to look at the two editions of Brockman and Big Science and Archaeology. Look at the 1963 edition and look at, I think it's the 1969 edition. And the most extraordinary change in the same book, trying to draw together kind of what kind of techniques we've got at our disposal. So there was this fantastic revolution in methods going on, which underpins virtually everything that we do right across the main range of archaeological science today. So let's move now. We're going to move to Colin.
Right.
I should say.
I think best on my feet, so I'll stand to my feet if you'll allow me, and move to the podium, because if we're talking about Lewis Binford, we have to remember that Lewis Binford's background was in the American South, and he has a wonderful evangelical style when he's in the flow of things. Now, Pamela Smith has said to each of us, certainly said to me, it's very important to be personal. And I think she meant personal about oneself, although I may be personal about one or two other people in the course of my remarks. But she suggested that it might be appropriate, first of all, I'm sure I must have talked for more than 15 minutes, but it might be appropriate to say...
5 to 10.
10. Well, that's 5 gone already. So half the time for some personal reflections, and then some for more general reflections. So I came up to Cambridge in 1958, and I read natural sciences for part 1. And one of the things I did in reading natural sciences was the history and philosophy of science. And that was a very good start to anything. I'd always been interested in archaeology, and when I asked myself, what am I really going to do next? I wasn't going to be a great physicist. I didn't think I was going to be a captain of industry. I quite thought I'd like to be an archaeologist. So I changed to archaeology at the end of part 1, which is easy to do in Cambridge, and I did a 2-year part 2 in archaeology. And I was very lucky that the department then was a lively place to be in. There were different figures. There was Graeme, who was the father really of ecological archaeology. There was Glyn Daniel, who was not only a historian of archaeology, but thought about the nature of archaeology in a serious way. There was John Coles, who was an excellent teacher. There was Charles McBurney, who was fired with enthusiasm for the Paleolithic period, an enthusiasm which only caught on to me slightly later, I have to say. So that was the world I came into, and remember that was a Cambridge, and of course things were changing. That was between the publication of the structure of DNA, the double helix, and the award of the Nobel Prize to those who received it, to Crick and Watson and so on, for that great discovery. And so I'd find it interesting to do some biochemistry as part of the Part 1 Natural Sciences. The thing about the new archaeology is, though, that it arose, I think, from the interests of the time. That's why I'm referring to the Cambridge of that time. The new archaeology, of course, arose in several places, and there's no doubt at all that its principal exponent was and is Lewis Binford, who was at Chicago at the key time in question. But I mention the philosophy of science deliberately because I think one can see that the new archaeology was a new current in archaeology that, as Graeme has already said, came from 1 or 2 different strands. One strand was a skepticism about the existing archaeology, which Gordon Childe himself called a kind of pseudo-history, or suggested it was the attempt to write history without the historical sources, using cultures, archaeological cultures, in place of battles and historical personages. And it was clear that that really wasn't working very well. And as Graeme said, a lot of effort had gone into constructing space-time frameworks, chest of drawers, chronologies. And one could be doubtful about the value of that and about a lot else that was going on. Secondly, I think one of the key issues in the new archaeology and in all archaeology since is how do you explain things? What is the nature of explanation? What are we doing as archaeologists? And that essentially is the philosophy of science. What are the theoretical underpinnings of this enterprise of doing archaeology? And in Cambridge, we were fortunate in having a really very good philosopher of science, Richard Bevan Braithwaite, whose book Scientific Explanation remains, I think, one of the best introductions. In the United States, I'm afraid, they were less well off. They had Carl Hempel. I remember when I was doing philosophy of science, reading Carl Hempel's paper on explanation in history, where Carl Hempel set out that all explanations are law-like explanations, and therefore you can only have explanation in history if you do it through law-like explanations. And I thought at the time this really doesn't work, and I've thought that ever since. If we want to see one of the things that went wrong with the new archaeology, one of the great misfortunes of the new archaeology was that American new archaeologists all relied on Carl Hempel, and so they all got their philosophy of science in a bit of a twist. That is how, to some extent, I'm sorry, I may say one or two things that Mike Schiffer, for instance, doesn't agree with, but that's one of the hazards of starting off first. The third strand in the new archaeology was the numerical methods which were becoming available at that time. Already people like Flinders Petrie had used numerical methods in a very ingenious way right at the beginning of the 20th century. But computers were coming into operation and statistical methods, probabilistic statistics, were being applied. And those were one of the ingredients of the current of the time. And then, as Graeme has said, there was archaeological science. And there were two directions in archaeological science that were hugely influential. One was ecological archaeology, where Graham Clark was a great champion, followed later on by Eric Higgs. The notion that if you really understand the subsistence base and the climatic base, you've got what it wants. And that was very much a thought which underlay much of the early new archaeology in the United States also. Mainly, I think, because Lewis Binford is essentially a Paleolithic person rather than a Neolithic or Bronze Age or historical person. And so it's naturally the case, I think, that the ecological circumstances and the climatic circumstances play a very dominant role in Paleolithic archaeology. And as I've remarked to Lou Binford himself, he often finds it difficult to sort of climb out of the cave or the Paleolithic trench and emerge into a more recent world where societies become more complex. So the social aspects didn't interest him personally as much as the ecological ones. And then there was the impact of radiocarbon dating. That was very powerful in Europe because the old chronologies for European prehistory in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods collapsed entirely. But it was also influential in the United States. And Binford has stressed that in discussions which are on record. It showed that the culture historical approach was very capable of getting things wrong. So that was the background to the new archaeology. I first encountered Binford, I first encountered him in writing when I received a copy of his paper, Post-Pleistocene Adaptations. which I've brought several sacred writings of the new archaeology here. Here is one precious holy book, New Perspectives in Archaeology by Binford, published in 1968, which, as you know, was the annus mirabilis of the new archaeology. That paper, Post-Pleistocene Adaptations, was thinking in very challenging ways. It was asking, how do we know things? What kind of arguments can we use? Was seeking to use demographic arguments in a very effective way. And it's fair to say, I think, that the beginning of the new archaeology is to be dated from Binford's first significant paper in his series of American antiquity papers. That was Archaeology as Anthropology in 1962. And that was one of the slogans which he used. But one of the points I want to stress is that the new archaeology was in the air, and it was in the air as much in Britain and perhaps in Scandinavia as in the United States. And the reason that 1968 was the annus mirabilis for the new archaeology, it was the year in which, if I can find that other holy writing, here it is, Analytical Archaeology by David Clarke, that was also published in 1968. And that is, in many ways, a much more coherent book. It's a single author work. It's a much more coherent book than New Perspectives in Archaeology, which was edited by Binford and his then wife Sally Binford. And so both books, but particularly David Clarke's book, used numerical methods, emphasized quantitative methods. David Clarke was one of the first to apply computer manipulation to archaeological data, but strangely, Roy Hodgson is very often forgotten as one of the founders of the British New Archaeology. Here is his book with Jim Doran, and it was Roy Hodgson who organized a conference in Romania in the 1960s, and who was one of the figures who was willing to think about archaeological patterning in new ways. So they were indeed exciting times. I see that I shall run out of time in a couple of minutes. I first met Binford in 1967 when I went for a term to teach at UCLA, and he was also teaching there, having been sacked from Chicago. Didn't get on very well with Robert Braidwood there, but anyway, he was going great guns in UCLA, and one of the things about Binford is that he's enormously polemical. If you have an argument with Binford, you've got your work cut out to win it. It can be done, but it's hard work, but he won't tell you that you've won it. That I've never heard him concede. And that actually is one of the reasons that Binford's own work has been less influential over the past 2 or 3 decades than it was earlier, because Binford has had very few students of his own who've gone on to be sort of blessed by Binford and out into the world, because Binford doesn't bless people very often. And you can count on the fingers of one hand those who have received and retained the Binfordian blessing. It was one of the great tragedies of the new archaeology that David Clarke died so young. He died only a few years after publishing Analytical Archaeology, because he was a figure of great dynamism. Of course, he had colleagues and successors, one of whom was Andrew Sherratt, who very sadly died only recently, and they carried on the approach of David Clarke. But both Clarke and Binford were advocates of generalization in archaeology and advocates of good explanation. Now, the new archaeology began to go wrong. First of all, it began to age, and it's now rather like the Pont Neuf in constant need of conservation, and it's no longer new, and that, I think, is why the word processual archaeology is chosen, though I've always disliked the isms. I look a little askance at this very fine book, which I received today by Mike Schiffer and colleagues, Archaeology as a Process, that's fine. Processualism and its progeny. I'm not sure that I would want to be the progeny of an ism, even. So I just slightly question whether we want to be celebrating processualism here today. Let us celebrate the continuing development of the new archaeology. Where it went wrong, I think, was when it embraced too seriously the kind of philosophy of science that demoniacal figure Carl Hempel advocated, so that Redmond, Watson and Leblanc published in 1971 a book, Explanation in Archaeology, which I think is mechanistic in relation to explanation and also erroneous. And to be both mechanistic and erroneous is unfortunate. I think the new archaeology narrowed itself at that point. In my own view of the world, so-called post-processual archaeology, very good, I'm just going to give you this important observation before I sit down. Post-processual archaeology, I still see as within the broad church of processual archaeology. It is schismatic, but broad churches have their schisms. You have the Orthodox Church and the Church of Rome. You have the Protestant Church and the Church of Rome. Mr. Paisley refers to the Pope as a Scarlet Lady. Well, I don't know how Ian Hodder refers to Lewis Binford, not in those terms, but it's a schism of a rather similar kind. The point I'm making is that I think the world was changed with the aspirations, the exciting aspirations of the new archaeology in the 1960s, and the Annus Mirabilis was 1968, and after the publication of Explanation in Archaeology, it went into something of a decline. Thank you.
Well, it's always hard to follow Colin, but if Colin was Crick, then I was Watson. I went up to Harvard from a little tiny town in Colorado. At least Colin knew where he was going when he went to Cambridge. When I went to the other Cambridge, I had no idea what Harvard was like. And I went to do mathematics. I changed, as did Colin, a few years later, when I took a course from George Homans. Homans was a sociologist, a philosopher of science, who thought that one of the best books on the philosophy of science was a guy named Braithwaite. Did a book called Scientific Explanation. Thought that another reasonably good book was a gentleman by the name of Karl Popper. Thought that Hempel was kind of, well, a has-been, a guy who tried. And I think it would be most unfair to think that the Newell version of the new archaeology was an archaeology based upon Hempel. The second thing I'd like to say is that the new archaeology was not new in contrast to the old archaeology. The new archaeology was part of a general movement that was taking part across all the fields. There was the new mathematics. There was the new biology. There was the new physics. There was Watson and Crick. You know, there was the changing to molecular biology. And we thought that one of the things that would happen was that we would begin to actually democratize science and to democratize archaeology. When I came up to Harvard, amongst the archaeologists, there was only one archaeologist who took his salary. Everybody else clipped coupons. Coming from a small ranching town, I had no idea what this was like. But we realized that there was a kind of archaeology that went with class. And it was a kind of archaeology that said, in fact, one of my later teachers, Raymond Thompson, said in a famous article about property value, how do you judge archaeology? Well, you judge archaeology, ladies and gentlemen, by the archaeologist. If he's the right type of archaeologist, has the right kind of field work, well, then it's good archaeology. We said, wait a second. We think that archaeology can be done by anybody. You don't need to be the right type of archaeologist. And if you have an archaeology that begins, and Zubrow does it, and he does it wrong, then Schiffer can come back and redo it and do it right. It could be repeated. It could be replicable. The ideas were not ideas that could only be determined in some kind of cultural, historical view of what was right and wrong. So once this democratization of the field began to take place, it was not accidental that the democratization, at least in North America, took place in the West. It took place in places like Arizona, the University of Chicago, UCLA, and at Michigan. And in fact, when it began at places like Harvard and Dietz, James Dietz, who came to do historical archaeology at Harvard with the idea of trying to bring the new archaeology to Harvard, it didn't work. And in fact, what he had to do was he went to Santa Barbara. At the same time, Binford was there. And Santa Barbara, Binford, and Spalding were all in one university at a time. And a whole group of us decided we would try to follow these guys to see how archaeology could be done in a repetitive, more scientific way. What was the underlying theoretical formulation? One of the underlying theoretical formulations was something which you all are familiar with and which we use every single day today. Processual archaeology is based upon systems theory. It was based upon the idea that culture is a system, that there are functions, that there are functional relationships between the sociological sphere, the material sphere, the ideological sphere, and that you could go from one of these spheres to another sphere if you did the archaeology right. And in fact, just like every one of you uses a system today in your PC or on your telephone, most of us, when we're doing modern archaeology, whether it is processual or post-processual or anything else, we think in terms of culture being a system. And this was one of the underlying good ideas. I want to just say a couple other things about the sociology of it, in addition to the democratization and the empowerment. Because what we were doing was trying to empower a group of people to become archaeologists. One of the places where this happened was in a series of field schools, one of which was Grasshopper at the University of Arizona, one of which was Vernon, which was run out of the Field Museum in Chicago, where a group of graduate students were financed by senior archaeologists, not who necessarily agreed with what we were doing, but were willing to say, go out and try it, and look at the results. And if you look at the people who came out of those schools, I mean, well, there's actually a picture in 1968 probably of some of us. There's myself next to Mark Leone, next to Fred Krog, and if you went a couple of steps over, you would have found Thomas Kuhn, who had come by to visit, and then another photograph, the famous economist Boulding, because what we were trying to do, and what the field schools were trying to do, was to see how we could fit into this general movement that was changing science around the world. The other thing I would like to point out, and then I'll stop, is that this was not only being done by archaeologists, it was being done also by the people who were supporting archaeologists. There was a guy named Bob Woodcock, which was it, Mike?
Bill.
Bill Woodcock, thank you. And his partner, who had come to academic press. And just like Rutledge with the post-processualists, they had said, what's new in this field? Let us know. And sure enough, I had a long airplane conversation with him. Mike, I know, has had long conversations with him over the years. And they published these new ideas. And by publishing these new ideas and by making them into the general press, we were able to make a change in the general environment. Another thing that happened along that line was we began to consciously try to take over some of the journals. So when Ed Wilmson, for example, became editor of American Antiquity, we celebrated because we could begin to get our articles into places where they would be read. And finally, of course, there were the conferences. There was the PECOS conferences. There was the TAGs. There were the conferences of the School of American Research, where I first met Colin, where we all began to ask the questions, could we change the nature of the way archaeology was done? And indeed, as Colin mentioned, this was also done not only in the United States, not only in Canada, not only in England, but it was done in Scandinavia as well. And it began to spread out from this beginning thing. But I guess if I have to leave you with one thought, it is the idea that I don't believe that processualism is dead. I am not unhappy to be a progeny of processualism. And in fact, I believe that processualism has lots to offer to archaeology still. I'm not ashamed of that book that Colin and I edited a while back ago. I don't know if he is, on the ancient mind. I think there's lots of things that we can do about validating the way the individual thinks. Not just interpreting the way the individual thinks, but actually demonstrating that what the individual is thinking in the past. Yes, it takes a different kind of new archaeology, if you will, than the new archaeology of the 1960s. But anything that can be validated with regards to thought is useful. And I guess the challenge which the processual archaeologists still bring up to the post-processualists is the following. You interpret it one way, Mr. Hodder. I interpret it another way, Mr. Shanks. I interpret it a third way, Mr. Zubrow. Whose interpretation is right, and how do we make the decision between us? Do we do it basically in the old way of the cultural historians? Well, Mr. Hodder has the best reputation, and we use probity value? Or do we go back and we say, as I would like to suggest to all of you, that what we do is figure out ways to actually validate our ideas and our hypotheses that come out of the idea that you have systems with regards to culture.
Well, you've heard the heavyweights, and now it's time for a little comic relief. Thank you, Pam, for inviting me, making it possible for me to come. And she asked me to be very personal about this, and I'm afraid I'm going to be a lot more personal in terms of autobiography than the others have been. 40 years ago this semester, spring semester, I was in a class in field methods in archaeology. It was my first field exposure at UCLA. The class met on Saturdays, and we drove out to Ventura County and excavated in this dreadful site that was mostly fire-cracked rock. And Jim Hill was the teacher. Jim Hill was a freshly minted PhD from the University of Chicago who had studied under Binford and did one of the classic studies of ceramic sociology. And among the readings in this class was Binford's Archaeology is Anthropology, which Professor Renfrew has already mentioned as being usually the starting point, thought of as the starting point of new archaeology. Well, I read this paper and it was completely opaque. After all, I was a sophomore and undergraduate, and I also discovered that the graduate students thought it was opaque at least the first 2 or 3 times they read it. Now, this was before Sally Binford was in the practice of translating Binford's papers into English. What Colin neglected to mention was that Sally was the senior editor on this book, New Perspectives. And the reason why his papers in there are so lucid and so influential was that she rewrote them. And I know this because I was at UCLA when that was going on. Okay, now let me give you a little broader context to explain how it is this naive sophomore became enraptured with the new archaeology and the possibility of making a career as an archaeologist despite his parents' objections. Well, think about the mid-1960s, late 1960s. In the United States, enrollment in universities was expanding vastly because of the baby boomers. New colleges were being built, old colleges were being expanded. There was a huge demographic shift, and Ezra characterized it as the democratization in many respects of higher education in the United States. And opportunities abounded. It was also a generation when people were rejecting a lot of traditional values. And it was a time when the Vietnam War was ginning up, and a lot of us were really upset about the direction. I started out as a chemistry major, and I did not want to become a cog in a war machine. So a lot of us at that time were looking for something to grasp, something firm to grab onto, something that would make our lives meaningful. And I was a very impressionable undergraduate, and I was looking for a field in which I could distinguish myself, because prior to that time, I was totally undistinguished in everything that I tried. And so I was looking around, and Binford, as I'll tell you in a minute, provided kind of a blueprint for a new way of engaging society, a new way to become someone who could establish a career. I was ambitious, but I was totally undirected, and I had terrible work habits. But Binford kind of focused my attention on what might be possible. And so after that exposure to his writing in the 66 class of field work, I determined to take some classes from him because he was teaching. I didn't know that Colin was there at the same time. I might have taken a class from him. I could have had a totally different career trajectory. Think about that. Anyway, I took a class called Invention and Technology from him. And as a lecturer, Binford was absolutely unique. And Colin has already mentioned that he was like a Southern Baptist preacher. And add to this the fact that he's about 6'2", and probably about 230, 240, very imposing, gesturing, and a very loud, carrying voice, and the sort of person who really exemplifies authority and power. And this has an effect on undergraduate students, especially impressionable ones. So his unamplified voice would dominate a very large classroom, and he never used notes. He never brought in a note to his classes. It was all off the top of his head, and maybe that's why many of his lectures ran 10 or 20 minutes past the hour. But students stayed, rapt in rapt attention, because he believed so passionately in what he was trying to do in archaeology, and that passion was contagious among the undergraduate groupies, and I was one of them. Maybe this man had hold of transcendent truths about how to make archaeology into a real science. And it was almost a worshipful kind of thing. This was a man who really had a voice and had grabbed hold of something important. It was infectious. He had a mission, and he was the chief missionary. Well, in this class, he debunked culture historical explanations. It was basically a one quarter course tirade against culture history and its explanation for technological change and invention. And he didn't present a very coherent or complete framework for how to replace traditional diffusionism, but he presented kind of a mix of systems theory and biological ecology and evolution, a little bit of materialist anthropology and economic geography. And systems theory, by the way, was really good for first semester grad students because it was a dose of how to think like a scientist. But beyond that, I don't think it ever had much to say. But Ezra and I will disagree sharply about that. So, yes, Binford did recommend reading Leslie White's Science of Culture and Carl Hempel's Philosophy of Natural Science. And I read them both very carefully and assimilated much of the material. In his next class, Strategy of Archaeology, which stretched over 2 quarters, it was a class in which there were mostly graduate students, so I didn't actually enroll, but I did steal a set of the mimeographed readings so that I could keep up with what was going on. Now, the most obvious message that came through in that class, I don't think ever put into words, but what he was basically saying was that because traditional archaeology was so unscientific, it was basically intellectual rubbish ready to be discarded, and thus the field had to be built anew from different beginnings, from different foundational principles. And thus, a young person had the opportunity, someone like me, to enter the field and who could possibly contribute something significant and become a somebody. And so I saw this as an opportunity that I could take. Now, Colin pointed out that Binford he wasn't always very kind to his students and didn't bless them. I enjoyed blessing for about 1.5 years. And then we became enemies, mainly because I didn't follow him to New Mexico when he and Sally bailed from UCLA. And I think that was the start of some friction between us, which developed into the debates over the Pompey premise and all that horrid stuff in the 1980s. Now, one of the basic lessons that Binford provided in that class was the need to explain variability in the archaeological record. I took that as his most important substantive message, explaining variability. He always put it in terms of the Spalding trichotomy between form, time, and space. That turns out not to be very useful because time is inferred, and that's a different story. He also emphasized that independent causal processes could give rise to variability in the archaeological record. I took that as a really important insight. He did talk about the use of statistics for hypothesis testing and pattern discovery, and he used the Whitean definition of culture as a means of extrasomatic adaptation. Talked about explicit research designs and the need for them, philosophy of science, and so forth. And it took me a while to unlearn some of the things that Binford was teaching at that time, because the hypothesis testing framework, the hypothetico-deductive method, works really well in a science where you understand the sources of variability in things that might serve as evidence. It doesn't work so well necessarily when you're just at the beginning of the process of developing the principles that you need to understand variability. And so a lot of the early new archaeology ended up being sort of the sausage grinder hypothesis testing format that didn't really produce much new knowledge in the past, but it looked good. Time's up. Okay. Well, I got one. All right. New archaeology is still relevant, but with qualifications.
Obviously, Mike will contribute again. Sorry to cut himself off. I thought we'd do this in 10 minutes each. And I found that I should give something about my background, where I came from, too. I'm very much a child of the welfare state, like Robin and many people of our generation. We went to free primary schools, free secondary schools. They built universities for us. We're part of that world. We can't conceive why anybody of any age can vote Conservative. We've come out of that world. I came to university first generation. My father, as he drove me up, I was never interviewed here. I didn't know what the university was, didn't know what St John's College was, where I was put by the school. My father stopped at the stone and said, "Welcome to Cambridge," and he said, "You won't leave us, will you?" And took us up. So there's that whole sense of the big pathway coming up to this university. I did classics for 2 years, and then again I decided I probably wasn't clever enough to keep going in classics. And I'm very unclear about my kind of background for why I got vaguely interested in archaeology. There was a guy who'd been at the same school as me, like Pat Carter, who was a medieval archaeologist who died tragically a couple of years later. But he said there was this young up-and-coming researcher, some guy called Renfrew in the college, and I should meet him. And he introduced me to Colin, and Colin harangued me for half an hour about the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. I had no idea what he was talking about. It was on the eve of my Part 1 exams. I got sort of 15 exams in Latin prose and Greek prose the next day. And Colin then marched me through the courtyards of St John's and wheeled me into, he said, "I think you should see Glyn Dennell. In fact, I've rated him now." Marched me through. And Glyn said, "Oh, welcome, my boy. I hear you've joined archaeology. Sign here." And Colin and I then had a discussion, and Colin said there is this thing called field work. You should go on excavations. There is this very nice man called Lawrence Barfield who's looking for people to dig in the site in northern Italy, and there's this terrible man called Eric Higgs, and he makes you pay to go on the excavations. It's terrible living conditions. You pay 5 shillings a day. But that time's long enough. Anyway, I wrote to Lawrence, and he said, "Terribly sorry, no room." And I was signed up to go for 2 months with Eric to Greece. I went to see this bizarre character. He was sitting in the bone room, now under the West Building. And again, he talked to me about why it was a very good thing I should pay this 5 shillings a day and come out to Greece and so on. And then, in fact, I remember it was the night after the May ball, 5 in the morning, and there was a letter from Lawrence saying a place had come free in this site in northern Italy. So I went there for a month, and then I went to Kostritza for a month, which is young G. Barker, half of him up there, top left-hand corner. Eric's last month of the last excavation Eric Higgs was in Greece. So that was in 1967, summer of 1967, before I did classics. It was extraordinary. I mean, the Italian excavation first. I mean, I remember Lawrence Barfield he went on to Birmingham, had a career at Birmingham and retired a few years ago. And one day he said, "You know, young Barker," I cut my first section, he said, "You know, you could probably go on in this thing. You've got to make your mind up, really. You're either going to pots or flints." Without knowing it, obviously I came here and bones, and that was Eric, and that sort of got, because I mean, I have a background which is archaeology. I mean, it's a long way from where what I do now. So anyway, I then went on to Kostritza, this Greek Paleolithic cave. It was full of people that looked like something out of the River Kwai. It then turned out they were just long, thin students. They were staff. It was full of people that kept coming up with these impersonations of this man called Graeme Clark. And indeed, Tony Legg, who's here, was the arch, well, I know at staff. There were all these voices, and finally this character turned up with his wife, and there he was digging in the cave, and suddenly his voice said, "Well, no, I was at the start." And that was Graeme. And in fact, Graeme and I did a little excavation together, where without knowing it, I dug a hole in the side of the section, and we worked together. I'm actually my main link with Graeme, who actually always called me Robin Dennell, in fact. It never worked out who I was. And anyway, we dug a hole in the side of the Kostritza section together. Graeme was on board, he couldn't see what I was doing. I was inside digging a hole. I didn't know what cleaning a section was, so I dug a big hole in the side. So anyway, that was sort of the background. And I came to join this department, therefore. And it was an extraordinary time, because you had Graeme, you had people like Glyn Dennell, who weren't very reflective about the nature of the subject, but there was always sort of culture prehistory mode, and there were people like John Coles, who were sort of somewhere in the middle in terms of what they were arguing for. Eric Higgs had this extraordinary dynamism, and there was this man called David Clark. And so just to give you some sense, 1968, remember the world was in flames, Paris, the students erupted, burned the barricades. Rome, I remember, they rioted in what was later to be the British School at Rome, burning buses. in Cambridge, the students in the university had a sit-in in the Senate House demanding various rights. In the department, the students demanded the use of the staff coffee room. While the world was in flames, I was actually digging for Colin at Sitaguri. And when people say, what were you doing in the summer of 1968? These folks, it was the shooting of the students at Rice and all the rest of it. I was digging for Colin at Sitaguri. Anyway, the students demanded the use of the coffee room. And the key members of staff that were kind of the key people, always the students' friends, John Coles, Eric Higgs, said no way. And those who never went near the place, like Dennell, said actually perfectly fine. And that's why you've got the coffee room now today. That was what we achieved. And the other thing I have here is just to get a sense of my copy of Analytical Archaeology. And it says, happy 22nd birthday with love from Mummy and Daddy, October the 23rd, 1968. That's my 22nd birthday present last, because it was seen as a revolutionary. And I just say, I suppose very briefly, that time, I mean, there were these extraordinary people. Graeme, David Clarke, and Rob Foley knew much better. Actually, I thought he was a terrible teacher. He was a brilliant lecturer. And I used to have tutorials with Anthony Harding in Peterhouse, and David simply talked at us and he wrote notes down. Whereas Eric Higgs did have an extraordinary style. He only gave supervisions in his house down in Pampton Street. And I think, like any brilliant people, 95% of them was complete guff and 5% was quite inspiring. And so we had these different, I mean, he was a terrible lecturer, I think a brilliant teacher.
But he was having television on too.
Yes, in fact, I had two supervisions for my PhD. One, he was watching Match of the Day, a chart, and he looked at it and said, carry on, Parker. And the other, literally, he was in his Land Rover driving down the road, and I passed him I put the whole thesis in, I passed him on my bike. I said, is it all right, Mr. Higgs? He leaned out the window and said, it's all right, last chapter of it, and drove off. He was quite right, I was referred to the last chapter, he was a student. Anyway, I suppose, coming into it, therefore, I came into the classics, I didn't know this world, but it did, I suppose the thing that would you say was Eric Higgs' new archaeology was David Clarke? I think, looking back at new archaeology at the time, David Clarke, I remember, gave 8 lectures, 4 on the Neolithic, 4 on the Bronze Age, because I think John Coles was off that year. And I still have, I think, my main grasp of European prehistory, Neolithic is what David spun. He gave that, he had a grasp of a European prehistory, but essentially, I always thought fundamentally he was sort of a culture prehistorian with computing. And there was, there is a lot of argument in there for new ways, but fundamentally I think what turned on David were really the same sorts of questions in many ways that turned on underneath it all people like Dennell. And I suppose, you look at him and his beaker work, it was actually very much, it is a culture story. It was only really with the famous things like the Glastonbury article that you do get a kind of social systems, how do we try to, in a sense it was the broken K of British archaeology. But I must say, it was clearly the post-processual agenda has resulted in very different kinds of questions. But I did feel, certainly, and undoubtedly, Eric Higgs had his primary interest was in early prehistory. All of the things that one might think of as the structure of society was very interesting. All of the things that you think of, all about the kind of agency, role of the individual, he was just a mere noise. In other words, he really was interested. It wasn't a crude environmental determinism, but undoubtedly, I suppose what he got across to you, he was only interested in big questions. And I think that for an undergraduate, I think it was very much that, that we're sitting on 99.9% of the human past. We're mostly paid by public money. There is all the complexity of worrying about our relationship with the past. But as Ezra says, I think there's that sense, and in the end it's not games. In the end we've got powerful things to say to a public. People want simple stories from their past, whether they're killing each other in Bosnia or trying to tell stories like American policies now. People want to use and misuse the past, and taking us all through into a time team past. And it is a complicated past. It's more complicated than people like Eric or David Clarke saw. But I think that was the one thing that hit me moving from classics. That if you like, this was a crusade. We have big things to say about the past that matter. We don't have any sentimental allegiance to the past, but by God, it matters, and we've got to try to say things. That's what came across to me about that period. Okay. Yes. Quick. Do you want to start some quick comments and suggestions? How do you want to do it? Okay. We've got an hour.
Do you want questions about
I don't mind questions, reflection, whatever. Let's just try if we've got questions.
A couple of few things which have been mentioned here, like democratisation, cult figures, David Clark, Eric Hicks, and the 60s generally. I think what happened in the 60s was the internationalisation of the subject. We concentrated a lot on the internal changes like sequencing, computers, dating, those sorts of things, but wider changes also occurred. I think, looking back as a beneficiary of all three, are very important. First was cheap air travel. That by the time I graduated in 1969, I had travelled more than my entire family had ever in their entire lives, excluding the war. It was easy to hop onto a plane and get out a long way away at the other end, which meant if you did, it was as well to have something interesting to talk about. Now, I think what then started to happen, people came together a lot more from America, Scandinavia, Europe, Britain. So if you went to a conference and talked about, I don't know, a zillion microblade typology, you could bore the pants off people all over the world. But if you arrived and said, hey, I can talk about coastal exploitation in the Holocene, then you had an immediate wide audience that would listen to you and contribute to it. So I think that sort of thematic, those thematic developments, in many ways are consequences of people going to international conferences on a much more frequent basis. Secondly, inflation I think is very important and is often underrated. I mean, as another beneficiary of cheap air travel and inflation. The days of doing big excavations with scores of workmen, especially in foreign climes, was over by the 1960s. It was simply too expensive. And so there was an enormous incentive to get more bits of data per pound per cubic metre, if you like, than before. And I think there was a tremendous incentive that led to the development of the Higgs seeds and bone revolution. That Tony Legg and I, for example, in the 60s were among the first to do large-scale sieving and flotation of much more intensive excavations simply because we didn't have the money to do anything bigger. And that sort of trend kicked in worldwide as well, and I think that was very important. Certainly, Tony and I, Graeme, benefited enormously in some ways by the rising cost of excavation.
And survey.
And survey, yes, absolutely. And the third, which was alluded to in the States, was, and Graeme partly, that Graeme and I were both products of the baby boom of the 40s. Free education, free health, welfare state, and so on. But it was also the colossal expansion of higher education in the 60s. It obviously had a tremendous impact in the States, but it also had the same impact here, although we tend to be a bit more discreet in talking about it. I think in 1960 the undergraduate population in Britain was around 50,000. By the end of that decade it was 300,000. It's been rising ever since. And it suddenly meant there were an enormous cohort, especially from the 60s, a much more critical generation coming through, who were less deferential, more critical, more assertive, and who frankly found the old archaeology boring, which was my dominant memory of so much of my own tripod. And to have these cult figures on top of that, seducing you with new ideas and themes and methods, was irresistible. I think it's worth remembering the much wider changes which happened between, say, 1960 and 1970, culminating in the Annus Mirabilis of 1968.
Yes, I meant to say about the expansion, the fact that yes, all these people producing and we were able to go into a job, and it was a time I went straight from a PhD, finished my PhD in 93, straight into a lecture. And Robin the year after, so we know expansion. Marek, Marek?
I came to Cambridge actually in 1974 after I'd done my BA at Sheffield. I was lucky enough to actually have, by default, two supervisors. One was Dennell Clark, my official supervisor, and then David Clark was my personal tutor. And I ended up discussing archaeology with David Clark, almost as often as I did with Graeme Clark. Graeme Clark, as we all know, was rather a formal figure, and also rather a formidable figure, and in some ways rather a conservative figure, although he was also extremely kind. I remember one occasion when I had a supervision with him, and he always unnerved me by addressing me by my last name. So he would say, "My dear Zvelebil," just in that characteristic high-pitched voice. And while we were discussing something, the phone rang. And Graeme Clark picked it up, and he hated technology such as phones. So he picked it up and held it at this distance and said, "Hello?" And from the other end came some kind of a voice, jabber, 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 jabber. Turned out later on that was Leo Britling, his good friend, at that point Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Clark said, "Sorry, I can't hear you." A certain window into Graeme Clark's approach to things. But he was extremely helpful in his knowledge of European mythology and the kind of intellectual line and line that he had within him, going all the way to 19th century, the beginnings of paleoeconomic and ecological archaeology was absolutely second to none. Nevertheless, I would write chapters of my thesis for him. Graeme Clark would read it and say, "That sounds right, my dear brother." And then I'd give it to David Clark, and he tore it to pieces. It made me feel this small. And then I had to rewrite it again. So I'm grateful to both David Clark and Graeme Clark for instructing me in rather different ways. One was, I suppose, new archaeological, and the other one, I didn't know whether Graeme Clark could be called a new archaeologist. I thought that rather he was a paleoeconomic, paleo-environmental archaeologist, which has tried to move away from the prevailing culture-historical paradigm in quite a different direction than the new archaeologists have. Although he did use his, in 1957 actually, he published, in his book Archaeology and Society, he published a scheme that made it clear that he was really aware of what then became known as culture as a system, and was sort of a form of system studies, culture change. Reflecting on the new archaeology, and now moving towards sort of more substantive issue, I suppose, reflecting on the new archaeology and things that it has done for archaeology as a discipline, I would make a distinction here between archaeology as a discipline, as a procedure and as a methodology on one hand, and where the contribution of new archaeology is totally revolutionary, undisputable, and it made our explorations of the past incredibly more complex and complicated. But also, I think it gives us very clear framework, a blueprint almost, how to apprehend the past. On the other hand, I would also focus on the question of actually understanding the past as opposed to explanation of the past. And I know that Colin Renfrew, Colin said that annus mirabilis of the new archaeology was in 1968, but by 1971, when Explanations in Archaeology was published, it was already beginning to look a little bit iffy, and that means basically that the kind of the spring of new archaeology seems to have lasted for only 3 years. And maybe that's that. I don't know whether Colin meant it that way, but it might suggest the beginnings of the disappointment of new archaeology. In that, the question that I really have is how far has the application of new archaeology advanced our understanding of societies in the past prehistoric societies in particular, did the new archaeology deliver what it promised to deliver? And so while on one hand, the methodological advances were remarkable and revolutionary, did it actually, I'm sure it did, but to what extent did it actually advance our understanding of past society? And if you ask those two questions, perhaps we can begin to understand things that has puzzled me for a long time, which is the virulence of the reaction against the new archaeology by the post-processual archaeologists, post-modern archaeologists, the kind of extremely critical approach that many postmodern and post-processual archaeologists, I feel personally rather unjustifiably, still have towards new archaeology today.
So what, yeah?
Still have today towards new archaeology.
Two things I'd just like to comment on. One is that with regards to David Clark's and his analytical archaeology, I really saw it as as you said, a blueprint. I saw it as a map of how to do the new archaeology. And that it actually gave not only the general systems theory, but it also gave the techniques. The second thing I just wanted to comment on is with regards to what has been the result of the new archaeology as I see it. I would actually like to suggest to you that 90% of the archaeology that is done today around the world is really new archaeology or processual archaeology in one guise or another. That if we look at the vast majority of the cultural resource management that's going on in the New World and in Europe, if we look at the vast majority of the kinds of problems that we deal with, economic problems, social problems, ideological problems, how we actually formulate the problem comes out of the new archaeology. Sometimes we now take it and we'll do an interpretation on it, and we'll do it as a post-processual. But the actual analysis of the data, the way we use computers, the way we use statistical methods, the way I'm known for GIS, the way we use that kind of stuff is all based on an understanding of a systemic model of culture, a basic understanding of science, and that we do it using processual archaeology.
Could I make one quick answer to Marek saying, well, have we really got anywhere? And the one person who hasn't been mentioned, but two of his holy writings are on the table there, is Ken Flannery. And I think Ken Flannery's work is a wonderful example of how we've learned a great deal about the development of society in Oaxaca. I think the Cloud people, Zapotec civilization, starting from the early Mesoamerican village. I think that's a very good example of what I would certainly call new archaeology, but I'm not sure it would fall within stricter definitions of processualism.
I think it does.
It does.
Paradigmatic.
Good.
Well, for each article, there's Robert's one again. I'd also like to start getting people coming fields as well.
Okay, well, just very quickly, I suppose my interesting perspective is that I lived through it all as a graduate student. I mean, I was a graduate student at the same time as Colin. I graduated in '62. I took my PhD in '67. So that was the period that the new archaeology was taking ground. I'd never heard of Lou Binford until about 1964 or 65. I'd heard there was somebody in America who was working on the Mysterion as I was working on the Mysterion. Never heard his name, but it just occurred to me that if somebody else is working on it, he's going to come to exactly the same conclusion that I came to. So I rushed to get my ideas into print. As it happened, of course, Lou Binford had come to absolutely the opposite conclusion, and we spent the next 10 or 20 years fighting about it. But having said that, I still think that Lou Binford was the most important thing to hit archaeology this century. I mean, I would actually put him ahead of Gordon Child. And why I think it swept the board and so excited people in the late 60s was what impressed me and why I became absolutely committed processualist or new archaeology was that it put the evidence on explicit models. It said, for God's sake, spell out your models. And I think the notion of models was terribly important. And David Clark and Colin both stressed this tremendously. They were very influenced by the movement of models in geography. So it put the emphasis on explicit models, preferably ones that you could sort of spell out as diagrams. Secondly, it put the emphasis on quantitative observations to be as quantitative and therefore scientific as it could be. It put the evidence on testing of models, but in the sense of being self-critical. I mean, it embraced science in the sense of Karl Popper. Karl Popper said the philosophy of science is conjecture and refutation. The essence of science is you try to refute your own ideas, if science is working properly. So it was a self-critical endeavor. I have always contrasted this, what I like least about some of the so-called post-processual archaeology is that it's not always totally clear about what it's saying. I'm not even sure it's trying to be totally clear. It's a little bit, for that reason, it's rather self-indulgent, and it often takes the emphasis away from data. I mean, I've heard Ian Hodder say several times in his more rabid days, it became more modest later, you know, that data doesn't exist. We can't, if I've got a certain number of pound coins on the table, we can never actually know how many. So it denied data. So that's the reason I still rather proud to think of myself as a processualist or a new archaeologist, if you like. Another great advantage of it was that it put emphasis on the kinds of data that we have access to. I mean, it put the emphasis on things like technology, subsistence, food supply, demography, settlement patterns, environment. It puts the emphasis on the kind of data that archaeologists have access to. And above all, it put the emphasis on explanation, particularly explanation of change. Now, it seems to me that if archaeologists can get at anything, it is, if we've got one grand agenda, it's explaining change. So it did put that emphasis on explicit models of change. The only final thing I would say is that there have been some rather nasty things said about rules and laws, and Mike Schiffer was, I think there's always talk about Mickey Mouse laws. In fact, the first time I saw Mike, he showed up at our door. We'd invited him to dinner in Sheffield, and he showed up at the door, and he was wearing a big tie with Mickey Mouse all over it, because he was giving Mickey Mouse. Now, all I would say to you is that although people say they don't like rules and laws, that if you scratch the surface of any kind of explanation, archaeology or anything else, scratch the surface of anything that claims to be an explanation, and you will find a generalization underlying. And there's no difference really between the generalization of what we might call a law. Scratch any explanation, you'll find a law underlying, which I think is what Mike said, and I'm sorry if he is being timid about that.
Well, not only does...
I can't think of an explanation that doesn't involve...
Yeah, not only do explanations involve... Not only do explanations involve law-like generalizations, but so does every archaeological inference.
Yeah, that's right.
We should let Ron.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm going to talk about laws.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll give you the feed if you like, to talk about the rules. But, no, I'm left to the last, and I think I'm probably the baby here.
That's frightening.
I'm the bastard child of archaeology, and I think that probably gives me a slightly different perspective, because when I went came to Cambridge in 1971, it was the sort of air you breathe, and I probably actually had one of those brutal introductions to the new archaeology that anybody ever had, because in fact in my gap year I trotted off to Turkey, as one did in 1970, and my excuse was to join an excavation out in East Anatolia with a a man called David French, who was an early convert to new archaeology. And after a horrendous journey in some dreadful bus, I arrived in this village and he met me. And he said, I said, I'm Foley and I'm going to Cambridge to study archaeology. I felt very proud of myself. And he just looked at me and said, are you a scientist? I said, no, I did history. He said, that's a pity. And I realised then that I was going to have something new to do in Cambridge. So my experience of the way the new archaeology was, I think, a very personal one as an undergraduate. And that, in a way, came from two elements. One, we've heard a lot about, which is David Clarke himself. And, I have no qualms in saying that I think he was an extraordinarily influential lecturer, teacher, and thinker in his publications. And I was at Peterhouse, so I saw a lot of him. And he was a tremendous man. I think one thing that one should add, in the light of, I think, was it Colin who said that Lou Binford is an enormous man. And David Clarke, on the other hand, was a very small man. I think he can't be more than 5'6", or something like that. And yet he was remarkably eloquent and a great speaker. And anyone who could come up with a phrase, which he obviously did purely to annoy his colleagues, that when he talked in one of his papers about the empty minds behind the floral waistcoats. People think of David Clarke as having written an impenetrable book in analytical archaeology, but actually he wrote, I think, very well and very clearly. The other important thing, I think, about being part of the Cambridge environment at that time was it wasn't that there was a particular idea. It was actually the clash of ideas. I mean, we've heard about supervisions with Higgs. Those of us who did the Paleolithic had supervisions with McBurney. Then we'd go off to Glendaniel and have supervisions on the history of archaeology and a glass of sherry. And then we'd have supervisions with David Clarke. And it was like being bounced around a squash court, because everywhere you went, you were told, really, this was the place you would get the true ideas, and you shouldn't listen to what anybody else said. And while there were damaging aspects about that in terms of undergraduate education, I think, on the other hand, it created a level of excitement, which has, in fact, I think, one of the reasons that the products of that period have been quite successful. So, really, those of you who are undergraduates here, what you need to do is to encourage your lecturers to argue more with each other. It's very good for the soul. Turning to the sort of more, the issue, which sort of touching on what Ezra and Mike and Colin have all said about the origins and the nature of the new archaeology, in the sense why it took the trajectory it did, which ultimately ended in a sense a revolution against itself. I think I feel even more strongly from having heard the talks this afternoon, is that actually new archaeology was two separate strands. An evolutionary biologist, I would say, has a polyphyletic origin, which happened for a particular period of time to be in an uneasy alliance with each other. And they were both rebelling against the cultural, historical, narrative approach. One came essentially from the view that we archaeologists were scientists and should be doing science of some sort. I think David Clarke was very firmly in that line. And the other was really those who saw it much more that archaeologists should be more anthropologists and be really tackling questions of anthropology. And for a brief period from about 65 to 75, those converged and actually worked very powerfully together. But I think it was a sort of unholy alliance in many ways, which had the seeds of its own destruction in it, and began to fall apart in a sense because the people who were interested in the anthropology started to draw their models from the great thinkers of the French postmodernist tradition, while those of us on that side of it, who just wanted to be boring scientists, were unattracted to that and pushed off into the fields that often hardly articulate. So you would have this coming together and then disappearing apart. So to some extent, the great throes of anxiety archaeologists had, I would actually say has only been on part of archaeology. The rest of it got on with other things. And I'll finish by just saying, of course, that's it's a reason for going back to analytical archaeology. The key word in analytical archaeology is analytical. If you read it again, if you read it for the first time, what strikes you is, as Ezra said, it is a way of doing things. David Clarke's emphasis was analysing data. It wasn't about building theory, that was just part of it. It was about how to analyse data. And I think that's why, in my own particular trajectory, because I bought into that and into the ecology of Cambridge and ultimately ended up in evolutionary biology, where the tension between models and theory and empiricism simply doesn't exist. In a sense, I think that's a natural home for a student of David Clarke's.
So that's true, and when Ezra started out, kind of, well, most people most of the time are still doing these things that started then, which is the science, the anthropology. I mean, the questions have often changed, but how we've gone about it. Look at most PhDs I'm examining in Cambridge. Mostly when you come and try to do it, first of all you end up in the rock and a hard place and trying to work out when things are. So any PhD now still finds actually chronology is not something that you just forget about and when it's done actually for most of the time. And then actually the whole business of trying to pull apart the archaeological record to really understand its formation and so on. So it's perfectly true, I think, that there are those hard cores, as Rob has said. I mean, the anthropology and the science came together then, and there were this interesting tension through those years. Still an awful lot of how you're trying to explain. So I think that the questions have changed, but many of those past questions remain good questions. And the subject was weaker because they weren't asking some of the questions that the post-processualists started to ask, but they were both good questions. In many ways, a lot of them, I would think, still rooted in what these people were doing. Contributions from the floor as well. We've got to have Tony, then there's a lady, sorry, I don't know, there's a Tony.
Yeah, coming from the college in London where I was long serving, can I just remind the audience that there are actually 3 people on the Nobel Prize for Structure of DNA. A third one came from Birkbeck College. Lou Binford I never knew well, but I did once buy him a curry which he greatly enjoyed, and overeating that we didn't find we had much to disagree about. But I'd just like to say a few words about Eric Higgs, because he was the person who was the most influential on the new archaeology in Cambridge, and I can claim some familiarity, having spent no less than 18 months digging with him, Graeme, 4 different sites in 6 years and 4 years research under his rather loose direction from the window of his Land Rover. He was a very complex and unusual man, but he wouldn't have thought of himself as a new archaeologist. What Eric saw was the unquantifiable lack of data on which archaeology was based. I know that word's unfashionable, but I found that very attractive because coming from experimental science, I was used to measuring things. I was used to measuring calories, that's what I did. And so I still do. I know that's sort of anathema to the sort of post-professional lobby, but Eric, of course, was himself a farmer, wasn't he? That was what he had done before he came into archaeology. He was originally an economist, inherited a farm, had a curious habit of appearing in books. He appears in a travel book based on Turkey. He appears in René Dumont's Touch of Rural Economy, where Dumont characterises him as a proud man, and he certainly would have been that. But I think the stimulus that he gave to all of us was to seek data, and this point of analytical archaeology, I think, is so important. He and David didn't disagree. He didn't understand what David was writing, but he didn't disagree with the approach, and I think that was his great contribution. I agree wholeheartedly that processualism still has an enormous amount to offer, because to me it is still the foundation. If we don't have a decent data set, then where do we go from there? I'm just a prosaic data gatherer and analyzer, I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do. But I've also been accused of imitating Graeme Clarke, but with great affection and respect I did on occasions. And let me just tell you this story, that on one occasion he came into the old bone room waving a great big floppy manuscript, and he said, "Oh, Eric," he said, "if Thames and Hudson would give me £20,000, I'd take this book, cut it to half its size and put it back into English." And that was the manuscript of analytical archaeology.
Gillian, you're up on the back. Is that right? No, something back. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Dr. Gillian Wallace. I am the senior member of King's College here at Cambridge. None of you are ethnic minorities. No problem. It's not your fault. It's called genetics, I think. None of you are from an Indigenous community. None of you have at least visible disabilities. And I'm not going to make too personal a comment, but one imagines that none of you are terribly clear. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whatever, you're not archaeologists of the female persuasion. Which person, and you can pick an anthropologist or an archaeologist from one of those backgrounds just described, do you think has been most significant to processualism? Is the fact that all of our esteemed invited speakers today are North American or European males evidence of a evolutionary progression of
the we discuss I think that we need to remember that there and there very early to start to think about the issues of slave archaeology in the New World and the issues of ethnicity and how you could do that both in a perceptual way. So I think that your characterization of suggesting that it was gender segregated, ethnic segregated, may be partially right numerically, but surely not right in terms of the fact that there were surely cultural heroes that we can define in both the ethnic minorities and with regards to gender.
We did have, if you remember, Gillian, there was quite a lot of talk about the role of Sally Binford. It wasn't just that she translated Lou Binford's stuff. I mean, she did research probably on functional interpretation of the Mysterium before he did. And of course, Carmel Schrerer, perhaps we should have mentioned Carmel Schrerer. She was a very major figure. So there were quite a few of them.
I mean, there's no question, obviously, say, given the time and the percentages, of course, there's no question at all that it was a male-dominated subject. Will be any different from any other? No. And when I think of the fellow undergraduates in my years, with the whole business at the time, most of them going to marriage, it was the whole sort of social context of trying to maintain a professional life or a PhD with children. In fact, my partner really got together more recently, but she was an undergraduate with me. Annie, do you want to say anything about that? Where are you? I saw you. It's just the kind of the role of women at the time.
I'd love to know, having a conversation just before about the different ways that men and women think. And there are different ways.
Sorry. Yes, this is the way.
Very small. I'm only a woman, I'm very small. I think there are, for me, different ways that men and women think, and much of the world and the way that lots of subjects are developed in the different worlds that I'm in now. You can see the difference in ways that men and women think. But I think it would be foolish to blame you or anybody else. I mean, I was an undergraduate at the time, but we were 10 to 1. In a sense, it's not surprising that few of us were successful. It was a different era. People with disabilities were not allowed to progress. They didn't get the advantages they have. I think what we should celebrate is it is a different world now, that we have learned, even us old fogies for that time, now know that people with disabilities, people from ethnic minorities can move forward. And I think that I don't find it helpful personally. I recognise what you're trying to say. I don't find it personally helpful to blame the past for the mistakes it made. We've made mistakes and we'll continue to make mistakes. But I think it is good if there are more people from different perspectives. And the perspectives are not necessarily gendered or to do with ethnicity, but they're about ranges of views and that challenge and the ways that different kinds of thinking can make a subject like archaeology very vibrant and more comfortable for people. What's important, I think, it has to be welcoming of people with different perspectives and different views. And I found archaeology actually, compared to many subjects, a subject of debate, a subject of challenge, where wherever you come from, whatever your perspective is, there is a place for you, and that's what makes it interesting and exciting.
Mary-Lee?
Very briefly pick up on this. I think it's retrospectively, it's probably very correct that you are males down there. In terms of thinking back at that, it would have been more interesting if you have also brought in some of the female voices. And actually, when you mentioned there were many women very prominently involved at that time, and it's very interesting to see their archaeological career, because some of those are now very, very strong voices within post-processual approaches. So I think there is, in terms of gender politics and the development from processual into post-processual, a very interesting philosophical and political issues.
And other things also, if you like, I mean, clearly there's all that socialism context, but in retrospect, again, are there particular kinds of questions, if you like, were of interest? When you think of the new archaeology driving question, I mean, you can see why the more open, reflective, protested gender, like there's room for a whole range of ways of thinking about the things that interest you. I mean, was it?
I think maybe it was also interesting that you all probably mentioned politics, and in some way that politics stayed back in the 60s, and the political development since then have very much been also focused on gender issue. And I think therefore the further development and how that differently affected someone like Paddy Watson, for example, who have moved tremendously from that point you mentioned. And I think it's the politics from the 60s to now that's actually come in there as part of it.
The only thing I was going to say was that the democratization of archaeology that began with the processualists, I see that democratization continuing with the gender agendas and the disability agendas, and as Mary Louise knows, I do major work on disability, and I'm an advocate for people with disabilities. That democratization is a continuing process.
Rachel Johnson.
Yeah, I just find it very interesting that a lot of the focus here on the new archaeology is about this sort of generation of revolution, about democratization of the discipline, and why the time when feminist politics was so much part of what people were thinking. Why when feminist politics was so much a part of everyday life, why that wasn't actively taken up by the new archaeology. Why did it take until the 1980s? A missed opportunity, really.
I mean, I can't answer that question, but I think it's probably the time now, because I mean, when I was an undergraduate in the 70s, it was an issue. Now, I mean, we've heard the context in which it is. I mean, a university in which there are relatively few women. We speak with feeling.
Only 3 women colleges, there was 20 to 1.
So I think that, in that particular context, but I think I think it's wrong to put it that nothing happened until the 80s. I think things were already being discussed. And actually, I remember David Clark's room. I had a room in the department which he gave to his research students, and I remember sitting in there one day when I was starting my PhD. It was about 1975, and the door burst open, and a group of women came in and declared that office the departmental creche. They left all their babies with me. Frightened the life out of me. So there was action. How much effect it was.
Pamela wanted to say that if undergraduates are asking questions, there's a bottle of wine per question. There's only 10 minutes. So I'll take one from Chris.
I'm just wondering, in terms of this looking back at the question of democratization, I mean, it must be quite an extraordinary thing to feel that one was part of the sense of a revolution. As look back in retrospect, I mean, do you really think it was such a change that aren't you being a little uncharitable to the generation that went before you? The sense that, Child was a systems thinker. They know exactly the same kind of systems thinker. But the sense of, so much happened in terms of, I mean, part of it also, the problems of almost like a break in generations because of the suicide makes it a very interesting time of generational change. But the whole issue about differences in financing, differences in scientific technique, like C14, is it really such a sense of absolute revolution in the 60s, or are there many trends going on? And that's one question, and I just wanted to give the other one, if it isn't. It is interesting to hear you talk this sense of, almost the sense of the cadre of Cambridge, and what a small world it was. And of course that world doesn't exist anymore. If you look at the lecturers in Cambridge, they don't really share the same education, they don't share the same values. It has become internationalized. And so I think the other thing that's part and parcel of that is that issue of, could that sense of revolution ever happen again? Was the sense of the small single university cadre, at least in Britain, I don't know about the American experience. Is that part of the importance and part of the impact of new archaeology, because it's such a small group that then goes on out into the world, becomes quite powerful?
I suppose my take on the two things. First is undoubtedly, yes, of course, looking back, you can see that there were many things that weren't so dramatically different. And I think Mike Schiffer was saying in his lecture today that in many ways the people who most understood, who most sympathised with his arguments about the formation of the archaeological record and so on, were the cultural historians of the time. And the second, I suppose that the cadre thing probably was something that was really not part of the American experience.
I can add something about the first question. I think I agree entirely with you, because actually if you look back at Graeme Clark's Archaeology and Society, or his economic basis, prehistoric Europe, the economic basis, which I think are fundamentally new books, because you can see a continuity and obviously with the child as well. And I think one might say that there was a lot more continuity in that period in the 60s and 70s than we have been saying. But in the sense we've been told to sit here and say what was something we knew, not what was. They still, learnt the stones with McBurney, and that was very dull sometimes. But I think actually one could make a case that the big fracture is actually much later. Since I've been very struck by Marek asked the question: what have we learned about prehistoric societies from the new archaeology? And nobody has sort of addressed this question on answers. And I think the movement away from archaeology as the study of the past towards it being a much broader questions about our own society is where you get a real shift in archaeology. And that's much later.
In fact, the first illustration of a systems model in archaeology was in Graeme Clark's Archaeology and Society with that diagram. So that was the first use there. But the thing that people would mention, but perhaps not stress enough, is that the new archaeology was self-consciously revolutionary in the sense it may not have been that different, but if you want to sell a new idea, you've always got to be revolutionary about it, which means not only trying to say new things, but viciously criticizing what has gone before. So, I mean, the new archaeology was massively critical of other people like Gordon Child with his fusionism and so on, and Lou Binford was massively, viciously critical of people there. But the thing you have to remember, the reason you have to do that is because you're trying to capture the younger generation. You're trying to capture the 20-year-olds. Now, the one thing that people in their teens and 20s are terrified of is being seen to be old-fashioned. If you tell a bunch of students that somebody is old-fashioned, it's like telling them that they don't have the latest mobile phone or they're not wearing the latest trainers. They're terrified of that. So if you want to come down the past, if you want to sell your view, you've got to pull down the past generation. Now, I lived through it with the new archaeology. I also lived through it, amazingly, with the post-processual archaeology. What Ian did, quite explicitly and brazenly and self-consciously, he attacked people who went before him. I mean, I've seen him attack Colin. I'll mention Lou Binford. I mean, Lou Binford on one occasion was set up here in a way that Lou Binford never forgot. So the way you launch it is to say that all these boring old farts, if I may use that expression, are old-fashioned. You don't want to be like them, do you? And then you're the new guru, you're the Pied Piper. Say, I will lead you to the future. It's all revolutionary, and that is the way you sell. You sell a new idea by shooting.
Is that a student arm for a glass bottle of wine?
Actually, I think Paul's trying to just answer it to an extent, but you.
Sorry?
So you've kind of almost answered my question. You are the revolutionary In the same, well, to an extent, and in the same way that post-processualists are reacting from you or against you.
Yeah.
So how are you personally or intellectually going to recruit my generation of undergraduates in the face of a post-processual revolution that's already happening?
Well, taking post-processual.
I think that what the post-processualists accomplished, after all the dust settled and all the animosities have attenuated a little bit, maybe not, but is that they broadened the range of questions that archaeologists could legitimately address about the past. And that will be seen, I think, as its greatest contribution. But they were clueless when it came to figuring out how to answer the questions. And that's when you go back to processual archaeology and behavioral archaeology, and you draw out models and concepts that are useful for answering questions about ideology, ritual, social power, all of the issues that became important and were prioritized by post-processual archaeology that had been pretty much neglected by the processualists in their time.
And a new terminology helps, just to give a one-word answer, so that if you call it cognitive archaeology, it sounds nice and new.
My name is Eric Robinson, and I'm a PhD student of Professor Zvelebil and Professor John Barrett. And I'm wondering, like the person that just asked the question, I'm wondering what we, as the post-processual generation, need to look forward to. Do you think that the phylogenetic method and new theories of cultural transmission, that reconciles both the advances, the methodological advances from processualism, and also the advances of post-processualism that Professor Schiffer just highlighted?
Who's going to examine this thesis?
Not with phylogenetics. I agree with you. I think the increasing interest that archaeologists have taken in evolution is to some extent a bit of a new movement. One sees it in a number of places in the States and also in the UK. For those of you who don't know, phylogenetics is the attempt to try and understand cultural change as a process of, rather Darwinian process of branching histories and trajectories and trying to understand the processes and the patterns of that. Now, I don't think it will bring together post-processualism and processing, but I think that's partly because, of course, setting up the question of force. Because I think processualists have always been interested in culture and the processes of culture. I think the difference is largely whether you take an empirical approach to culture and try and understand it as an evolutionary process, or whether it remains as a rather more intellectual concept. And the great strength of the sort of approaches you're talking about is it really provides some methods for trying to understand these processes of evolutionary change, or cultural change in an evolutionary context.
Hi there, I'm an undergraduate as well.
Another problem.
I consider myself lucky because I'm studying archaeology, anthropology, and social environment. But do you feel that to an extent now with archaeology being taught as a solitary discipline or something like French, for example, in some universities, we are losing the anthropological perspective on archaeology, and also perhaps the functionalist approach, which might be helpful.
Marek?
I'm personally gratified that we don't have a more interdisciplinary approach, in the sense that we address archaeology and the material culture, the question of material culture, without addressing either the social context of it by anthropology very often, or the population. Actually the individuals, the people, and the population that's behind it. And in my view, combining those three phenomena, the social context, through anthropology, the population, the biological population, whether it's via genetics or demographic studies. And study of material culture is actually the way forward.
Don't you think that there is something terribly wrong in that competitive dynamics that you thought about it, that some of you have really well identified quoting post-processualism, because you started from something which was how you should work using new techniques to something which looks like how you must think about archaeology, and coming from the continent, many of us just, why should we think like that? We don't care. So isn't there something terribly wrong in that competition?
Yeah, I'll play with it. To me, science is a process in which error is reduced over time, and it comes about because of competition between individual scientists who put forth views that others contest, and change takes place in that competitive environment. And so I don't see anything wrong with people putting forth strong arguments, contesting arguments with others. Some of the nastiest debates you'll ever find in the history of science are in 19th century physics. You know, the stuff in archaeology is tame compared to some of the things that went on in the past. I see it as a creative process, and I'm not upset about it by any means, except when it involves me and people dare to question what I say.
But you were a bottle of wine, can you?
Oh yeah, okay, I've got people around for dinner tonight. Thought I'd chip in. I think that all, like what I've heard here today, without pointing to ruin the supplies for supervision on Monday, I'm quite in towards that academic way of analysing archaeology. But I think it was Ezra said that with post-processual methods, you've got no way of deciding whose interpretation is right. And do you think that has a place in relating archaeology back to the public, in that you can let post-processual methods then take what we've discussed and relate it back to their individual groups without worrying too much about whether there's an overarching right interpretation?
Well, I'll try to answer it. I think there's a difference between advocacy and between science and social science, okay? When I am an advocate for people with disabilities, I make my argument as strongly as I can make it, and I try to influence legislatures, I try to influence the United Nations as we try to create the Charter for Human Rights for People with Disabilities. I try to influence the national legislatures in terms of trying to get money for new kinds of schools in India and so on and so forth. And I leave that to the politicians then, and to the communities that affect the politicians to make the decisions on what they think is right. I'll make the strongest argument I can make. On the other hand, when I'm trying to do archaeology, and I'm trying to look at it as a social science, and then I say to myself, what I'm trying to do is make a strong intellectual argument as well, but then I have to validate it with data. And then I have to deal with the conflict between other people who have other interpretations, other sets of hypotheses, other sets of data, and in the end, we will debate it, new sets will come out, and one of us will be right, one of us will be wrong, and the science goes forward. And so I actually think that you sit, because I'm afraid that people up here, with the exception of myself, who really thinks I'm 30 years old still, we sit at a wonderful moment. I mean, this is a time when the next paradigm, if you want to call it that, the next curious way of moving this field forward will take place. And whether or not it's phylogenetic, and if it is, I'm really happy to have somebody throw that out, test it, and I will buy right into it if it works. Or whatever other people do in terms of creating a new set of ideas, hypotheses, theories about how we can move archaeology forward. And we'll test it against the data and see how it comes around. What I don't want to see us do is simply spin our wheels saying that my interpretation is this, your interpretation is that, and we can't, and there is no way to move forward. Is that when we do advocacy, leave it to the community. When we do archaeology as a science, let's try to validate it.
I wonder if we've been sold a bit of a bill of goods here, because I mean everyone's accepted that there is something called processual archaeology, and I don't remember in the early to mid 70s that acceptance was there at all in this department or anywhere else. And new archaeology was exclusively the American Archaeology Associated with Lou Binford, and its only exponent known to me at the time in this country was Colin Renfrew, who was believed to be one of these, sort of a clone of these Americans. And there were lots of different...
But surely David Clarke was the great figure along with Lou Binford. If you're looking at those two books were the big moment.
No, you've decided to call all this processual archaeology, whereas at the time it seemed to me, and I'm still not convinced in hindsight that there was a processual archaeology. At the time it appeared that there were several quite different approaches, and ever since there's been lots more different approaches. So there was Eric Higgs's approach, David Clarke's approach. David Clarke seemed very different to us as undergraduates from what Lou Binford and the people were doing in the States, and then came symbolic and structural archaeology, Marxist archaeology, and all these other things. So I just wonder if this blanket acceptance that there was a phase called processual archaeology and there was an annus mirabilis in 1968. The only people in 1968 who linked analytical archaeology, I think, with new perspectives in archaeology were people who did not understand either. And so Glyn Daniel was the kind of person who said, oh yes, you know, there's analytical archaeology and that's the English version of that. But we don't have to accept that was really true.
But David Clarke said it so well in his article, The Loss of Innocence. That summed up, I think, what we were talking about. The questions, the new questions being posed after that 5-10 year period.
And the new bodies of theory that had to be built.
And I think you're wrong. I mean, at least in the United States. I think that we were very self-conscious of who we were. And that, you know, I would look at Mike Schiffer over there, and I would know that Mike Schiffer basically had the same general theoretical view that I had, and I would call him a new archaeologist. So sure, we would fight over details, and we might even fight over how we would do validation, or what the appropriate thing. But I knew that the underlying theoretical view would be the same as my own. And I think that was true when I met Colin for the first time, and it was true for Jim Hill and Ken Flannery, and for all the others. And we were self-conscious in the sense that we actually tried to send people to different departments. Marek was sent to Princeton, I was sent to Stanford, you know, Mike went to Arizona, and on it went.
But I think Matthew is right in that these were independent inventions of almost the same thing. I doubt whether, you know, David Clarke gave these extraordinarily charismatic lectures that packed the South Lecture in the mid-60s when I was finishing my thesis about 64-65. I very much doubt whether he would ever have talked about people like Lou Binford. So I think to him it was a completely independent development. I think it was only shortly later they found they were saying much the same things. And that
I think there was a diversity, you're absolutely right, and I think there's a kind of looking back tending to homogenise thing. I think part of it comes from this term processual. To be honest, I don't know whether it's used very much. New archaeology. It was, and I think the new archaeology, it only became processual archaeology when the post-processual is called it that. So it was a retrospective name.
Just before you say that, the people who attended this conference, I think, felt they were part of something that was new. That was the Sheffield conference on the explanation of knowledge.
I was there and so did I.
Could I just add a historiographic note? When Max Nalmer, whose book on archaeological theory should be here, when he presented it to David Clark, it said in German, David Clark said, "What a shame you wrote it in German, nothing exciting can be expressed in German."
Can I thank everybody before we break up? Thanks to all for coming. I hope we've got something else. I'd like to go